All right, folks. I'm going to get started here. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the last day of the 8th week. We are in the middle. We are beyond the middle. We are about to head into spring break, which means you're going to get a week off. I've already talked at length about what that means. It means an opportunity. Take the opportunity. Don't blow it. It's the last one you're going to get before everything starts raining down upon you and you are helpless against it, unless you fortify yourself now and prepare yourself for what's to come. So be very clear about what's to come. As far as what's to come in this class, I sent out an email today. I changed around the schedule slightly. The first Tuesday we get back, we will not be meeting, and that will push back our second exam by a day, which will give you an extra weekend to study for it. So it'll be, so we won't, so like you asked me last time, So we won't meet on Tuesday. And then the second exam will be 2 weeks from Tuesday as opposed to a week from that Thursday. So you'll have a little bit more time there. And then I'm off on I have to take the 18th off as well. I'll also put that on the syllabus. So there isn't any change as far as what we're going to cover because I knew that this would happen at the start of the semester. So I padded the semester with extra days. And that's where the changes were made. But I also figured might as well push the exam back an extra day just to give you that extra weekend. Hopefully that'll help. But again, you should be trying to get a firm hold on everything we've covered up until this point during the break so that you have it down and don't have much of a difficult time, heading into the second exam, etc. And then also, of course, spending the time that you have during the break to write your papers if you haven't done so yet. Just kind of knock some of that stuff out and alleviate the potential burden that can become, because it can become a burden. Any questions about anything? All right, so I'll send a reminder like that Sunday before that, the Sunday at the end of the break, just to remind you that we're not going to be on Tuesday or whatever, so you don't wind up coming for no reason. All right, so today we are going to jump through two really large problems from the end of chapter 9, just to kind of, again, give you more practice on how to work these problems, like solidify your understanding of the connections between cost, production, everything we've talked about, how to approach the problems, the mathematical techniques you need to employ in order to get to the solutions, what those solutions mean, all that. Because again, like the exam, a large part of it will be one of these big problems with a lot of parts, and it'll be very connected. And so if you don't know how it's all connected, you could wind up just like doing horribly on it if you don't really understand. Because if you start missing parts, you'll start missing other things, and then it all kind of goes to crap. But if you have it down, then it's pretty smooth. So like I said last time, with the second exam, I tend to have like a bimodal distribution, which has like two humps, like a lot of people on the top and a lot of people on the bottom, but not a lot in the middle. And it has a lot to do with either your ability to grasp these problems well or not. So I'm going to assume that the people that I see here all the time, you're going to be able to do that. So a lot of you are going to wind up in that upper end of the curve. So just make sure you're tuned into the practice today to kind of help to make sure that does happen. And then of course the rest will happen the way that happens. So we're going to go through two practice problems, and then we're going to start on chapter 10, which is the first market setting we're going to consider. When, again, using that framework that we've been developing on production and cost to analyze how firms make optimal decisions in varying market settings, which then lead to different market outcomes. And it all depends on how competitive the markets are. So we think about the two extreme ends of the competitive spectrum first. They're not the most common markets that actually wind up existing in practice, but anytime you're doing any kind of analysis, you always kind of want to consider how extreme the case can get on either side before you start talking about the in-between cases that will have varying characteristics of the extremes and like some new characteristics resulting from just the interaction of those different characteristics. And so we'll consider perfect competition first in Chapter 10, finish that off the week we get back. The next week after that, we'll cover monopoly, which is the other end of the spectrum in which there's only one firm dominating the market, defining the market, in which there's as little competition as there can possibly be, i.e. no competition. And then that'll end the second part of the course. And then we'll jump into the more complicated cases, the in-between ones that deal with oligopoly, which is many, not many, large firms of small number dominating the market. And those situations tend to be complicated because there's interdependence in decision making. These firms that dominate the market, they don't just take into consideration what's happening within their firm, but they also have to take into consideration what's happening to their rivals. Because their rivals and them share a market. It's a very small market, very few suppliers. And so they're all basically potentially moving the market up and down along a demand curve, which means that if somebody is lowering price, everybody has to lower price or else they get priced out of the market. So the complexity of that market setting requires more in-depth analysis, which is why we have two different chapters to cover that one, two different approaches, some standard models of oligopoly with your basic approach of math and considering costs and some other things. And the other one is called game theory. It's a way of sort of being able to try to analyze situations in which there is interdependence in decision making, and it helps us to sort of identify likely outcomes that are to occur in those situations via what's called Nash equilibria. And then beyond that, we'll talk about labor and capital, and just finally, the last chapter has to do with externalities, like external costs and benefits that markets may impose on others that they don't take into consideration, and just some issues that we could discuss related to that in terms of mitigating those situations, etc. So that's basically what the rest of the course is going to be. It's a lot, but it's not a lot. Time tends to move pretty quickly towards the end, so just keep that in mind. We will, again, be covering this first case, perfect competition, then monopoly, and then that will get us to the end of the second part of the course, and then that's what the second exam will cover. All right, so let's do some problems here. Your firm produces cars with the following production function: 80 KL to the 0.9. That's a Cobb-Douglas production function. Again, representing a very specific type of production in which the inputs into production are not perfect substitutes. They're imperfectly substitutable, meaning the rate at which the firm can substitute one for the others changes as they increase or decrease them. And we talked about why that is. And so this firm produces cars. And so this is output of cars per year. K is the number of units of capital employed, and L is the number of workers. In the short run, capital will be fixed at 20 units, which is what defines the short run. And input into production is fixed. We generally assume it is capital. What is the short run marginal product of labor when producing 1,000 cars? All right, so short run marginal product. So the first thing to note here is short run. How do we get to the short run in terms of our production function? To get into the short run production function, we do what? This is our long run production function because all inputs are variable. That's why we have two variables in there. Yes, we plug in our capital of 20 units into our production function, which gets us into the short run. All right, so here is our short run production function, having plugged in 20 units for K. Marginal product of labor, how do I get that? Take the derivative, right? All right. Now, when producing 1,000 cars, we need a certain amount of labor, and that amount of labor is what we're trying to figure out what the marginal product of it would be. And so we first need to figure out how many laborers we need to produce 1,000 cars. So that's the first step here. Well, that's the second step beyond getting us into the short run. So actually, no, this is the first step. Either way, you can do it either way. I did it. I thought I had done it the other way. I think it's with the second problem that I did it the other way. Anyway, here we took the derivative to get the marginal product of labor, again telling us at varying levels of the input of labor how much extra output we can produce by employing additional units of labor. So we need to solve for the labor amount here to figure out what the short run marginal product of labor is when producing 1,000 cars by plugging 1,000 into our production function, not into our marginal product of labor expression. We need to, because there's no Q you can plug in here. There's only a Q in our production function. We've already plugged in the 20 units for K. That's the short run production function. Set that equal to 1,000 to figure out how much labor it takes to produce 1,000 cars in the short run. So divide both sides by 16, raise both sides to 1 over the power of 1 over 0.9, and that's going to get us to 0.59 laborers to produce 1,000 cars. This is a very capital intensive production enterprise. Making cars usually takes a lot of capital, so that makes sense. All right, so this is how many laborers is necessary to produce 1,000 cars. So plugging that into our marginal product expression will tell us how much additional output can be produced by employing an additional unit of labor at the current level of labor, which is 0.59. I know it's a weird thing to think about, but hey, let's just accept that there is 2/3 of a person working for this firm. So plugging in 0.59 there will get us to the marginal product of labor to be 1517. So having already employed 0.59 units of labor, employing a next unit of labor will yield 1,517 units of output. Yeah. It's in the range. It's yeah. Something you did something slightly different than what I did, but that's basically the right answer. When I'm grading, I'm sure you've noticed that like I'm not looking for the precise answer that I have. I'm just looking that you did the exact thing and that your answer lies within the radius of my answer. That's reasonable. So, all right. So that's the short run marginal product of labor when producing 1,000 cars. What is the short run average product of labor at that production level? So average product is equal to what in general? Right. Total product over quantity, Q over the quantity of our labor input, the average product of labor. So divided by the amount of labor. So in this case, we've got 16,000, L raised to the 0.9. That's our production function. Divided by L will get us to our average product of labor expression. Plugging in 0.59 for labor tells us that on average, each laborer is producing 1,686 units at the current level of laborers. You could also have gotten that by just dividing 10,000 or 1,000 cars by 0.59. Same thing, because that's what we solved for earlier. All right, what if the rental rate for capital is $1,900 per year, so that's the price of capital, and the workers' compensation is $55,000 per year? What are the firm's fixed costs? So what are fixed costs in general? The product of capital times the rental rate. We have 20 units of capital. There's our rental rate. And so just multiplying those two, R times our fixed amount of capital. So 1,900 by 20 gets us fixed cost to be 38,000. What are the short run variable costs to produce 1,000 cars? All right, so remember, in order to get this, we need a variable cost expression. And even though I didn't explicitly ask for it, it's good to derive it because you're likely going to need it. And so remember, variable costs in general is wage times labor. but in terms of costs, costs are a function of quantity. And so we need to get our variable costs in terms of quantity. In order to do that, you need to solve for labor in terms of quantity from the production function. All right, so here's our wage times labor in terms of quantity equals our variable costs. Our wage is equal to 55,000. So labor in terms of quantity is what we need. So going up to our production function, short run production function, we just have to solve for L in terms of Q. So divide both sides by 1600, raise both sides to the power of 1 over 0.9, which is equal to 1.11. So here is our, again, our labor in terms of quantity. Multiplying that by the wage rate will get us to our variable cost equation. And now I plugged in 1,000. So remember, we're looking for the short run variable cost to produce 1,000 cars. Plugging in Q equals 1,000 here and doing the math correctly, remembering the order of operations, we'll get the variable cost to be $32,626. So there's our fixed cost. There is our variable cost. What is the short run average variable cost at that level of output? So how do we get our average variable cost? Not total cost. So variable cost divided by the amount of output, which is 1,000 cars that we're considering. So yes. So again, 32,626 divided by 1,000 gets us to the average variable cost to be $32.63. That means that on average, each car that's being produced at the level that is being produced, at the level that the inputs are being employed at, the cost of them, $32.63 is attributable to the wages that are being paid out. So that's the part of the cost of each car that's attributable to labor on average for the amount that's being produced. $32.63. What is the short run average total cost at that level? How can we get that? Right. So how do we get total cost? Exactly. So we can add our fixed cost plus our variable cost. That will get us to our total cost divided by the quantity, which is 1,000, to get us to the average total cost. It's also equal to the average fixed cost plus the average variable cost. Either way will work. So there's our average variable cost. Our average fixed cost is 38,000 divided by Q, which is 38. And so therefore our average total cost is equal to $70.63. The average cost of producing is going to be $70.63. It is indeed 1903. All right, question 7. What is the short run marginal cost of producing one more car at that output level? Of what? Right, so we need the total cost function to get the marginal cost. So that is why we needed to solve for the variable cost expression first, because we're going to need that to put it together to get an equation for our total cost, take the derivative of that to get the marginal cost, and then figure out what the marginal cost is of producing 1,000 cars. So here is our total cost equation. Again, total cost is a function of quantity, which is why we needed to get our labor in terms of quantity to get our variable cost expression correct. So now we're going to take the derivative, but we have this Q inside this parentheses. You want to take that out in order to be able to take the derivative properly and not, screw up the fact that we have 1 over 1,600 raised to the power of 1.11 in there as well. So I'm going to take out Q raised to the power of 1.11 there. Just based on the properties of exponents, I can do that. All right, now I'm going to take the derivative with respect to quantity, right? Multiply this whole term by 1.11, subtract 1 from it. This one obviously drops out. So that is our marginal cost expression. With stuff like this, I don't generally simplify unless I absolutely need to, unless I'm looking for an actual number, because the numbers wind up getting really small and ugly, and might as well just leave it because it's really understood to just be one number. All right, so what's the short run marginal cost of producing one more car at that output level? Well, we're producing 1,000 cars, so we have to plug in Q equals 1,000, and then that'll tell us how much it would cost to produce an additional car. So just plugging in 1,000 there. Now solving for all this other stuff on top of this gets us to the marginal cost to be $36.25. So the cost of producing an additional unit, additional car, is $36.25. So again, it's one thing to kind of listen to me and understand what I'm doing. It's another thing to do it yourself. So you got to make sure you are practicing this stuff. You are doing it. You're doing it without like any guidance, so that you just really understand where you have to get the information from in order to get to where you need to get to. And ultimately also think about what you're doing so that you can explain what this means and what it meant to have the marginal product of labor at 10 units be whatever. What does that mean? When we look at the marginal rate of technical substitution, what does that mean? Like, you have to understand what it means as well beyond just being able to solve for these things. So make sure that you are gaining those insights by practicing my practice problems. All right, question 8. What is the marginal rate of technical substitution at that output level in the short run? Assume that K is plotted on the vertical axis and L on the horizontal axis. All right, so what is the marginal rate of technical substitution? How can we express it in a way that will allow us to solve for it here? Without looking at your notes. I'm just kidding. The marginal rate, first of all, what is the marginal rate of technical substitution in general? It's a long run concept. Right. Okay. You're like partly there. Right. Okay, so that's how we can express it, and that's how we can solve for it. But what does it mean? In order to what? Exactly. In order to maintain the same level of output. The rate at which you can exchange labor for capital in order to maintain the same level of output in the long run when all inputs into production are variable. The marginal rate of technical substitution is the slope of the iso quant lines. All right. So we know that it is the ratio of the marginal product of labor to the marginal product of capital. So we need to get those marginal products. We did the marginal product of labor already, so we need the marginal product of capital. Here's our marginal product of labor, but here is the long run marginal product of labor where we did not plug in capital. And here is our marginal product of capital. Again, these are partial derivatives with respect to labor first and with respect to capital. So whenever you're taking the partial derivative, you assume the other variable to just be a constant. Treat it like a number. You just leave it alone. So marginal product of capital, multiply the whole thing by 1, subtract 1 from the exponent, which is k raised to the power of 0, which is equal to 1. So you're left with 80 times L raised to the 0.9. That's the expression for the marginal product of capital. Anyway, those are our expressions. We'll take the ratio of the two. So I took the ratio of the two. L raised to the power of negative 0.1, L raised to the power of 0.9 there. And then I plugged in K equals 1,000 because we're looking at that output level, what the marginal rate of technical substitution is. So I plugged that in, and now I just need to simplify this. So we're going to have negative 18, and then you got L raised to the power of negative 0.1 over L raised to the power of 0.9. That's equal to L raised to the power of negative 0.1 minus 9. So L raised to the power of negative 1, which is equal to 1 over L, right? And then 1440 divided by 80 is equal to 18. So that's our marginal rate of technical substitution. So that means that, again, depending on how much labor we put in here, like that tells us the amount of capital we need in order to maintain our output level at 1,000. Is it 1,000 or 10,000? It's 1,000. So in this case, it is equal to 0.59. I'm sorry, we're plugging in 0.59. That's how much labor we're using. So we plugged in 0.59. We're looking for the marginal rate of technical substitution at that level. Again, at that level, we needed 0.59 units of labor. So I plug that in, and I'm going to get a number for it. So it's going to be 18 divided by 0.59, which is 30.34. Can someone interpret that for me? To maintain that level of output, right? So to maintain the same level of output, the firm would need to trade out 30.34 units of capital for labor. That's what the marginal rate of technical substitution is telling us. So it said at that level of output, which we assumed to be 1,000. Did we plug? Oh yeah, that's right. We plugged in 20 for K, right? Exactly. Yeah, which is what we need to produce the amount that's being produced. All right, marginal rate of technical substitution. There it is. What is the slope of the ISO cost line? Assume that K is plotted on the vertical axis and L on the horizontal axis. So what is the slope of the ISO cost line in general? It's the ratio of what to what? So remember, the ISO cost represents the same cost of employing different combinations of the two inputs. It behaves like the budget line for the firm. It basically represents their budget for however much they're willing to spend. And the slope represents the market rate of substitution, the rate at which the two inputs can be traded in markets based on their prices. And we can derive that to be equal to a ratio of not labor to capital, because it's a market rate of substitution, so not capital labor, because we're talking about prices, right? The other way around. The negative ratio of the wage rate to the rental rate. The negative ratio of the price of the input on the x-axis to the price of the input on the y-axis. So that is the market rate of substitution. That is the slope of the ISO cost line. So there you are, wage over rental rate of capital. Wage is equal to, in this case, we were told earlier it was 55,000 and the rental rate is 1,900. So in markets, 1 unit of labor is worth 28.95 units of capital in markets. All right, how much labor should the firm use in the long run to produce 1,000 cars? All right, so remember, in the long run, to choose their optimal input, they need to set their marginal rate of technical substitution equal to their market rate of substitution, right? Now, in the long run, both will be variable, and so you need two equations to solve for both variables. Now, one equation is the production function. You set the production function equal to a target level of output, which is 1,000, and that provides you a way to relate capital to labor. Then there's another expression that will relate capital to labor. It is the optimal ratio of the two that will minimize costs. And how do we get that? Right. So what happens at the point where it's optimal for those two curves? Like what is equivalent? Yeah. What is that? What is the slope of the iso quant and the iso cost called again? What are they called? Right. Is equal to, right, which is the market rate of substitution. So at the optimal input selection that minimizes the cost of producing a certain level of output in the long run, those are equal. So if you set them equal to each other, you'll be able to find another relation between capital and labor, the second one you need to be able to solve for your optimal amount of capital and labor in the long run that minimizes your costs. So marginal rate of technical substitution is equal to the slope of the iso cost line. Setting our marginal rate of technical substitution equal to our iso cost line gets us this expression here. This again is derived by taking the marginal product of labor and the marginal product of capital, the ratio of each, and then simplifying it. And then this is the market rate of substitution, the ratio of the wage rate to the rental rate, again simplified. And so just cross multiplying there gets me to, and then dividing both sides by 9 gets me to this ratio that tells me that 1 unit of capital equals 32.16 units of labor in the optimal selection of these two inputs. So 32 to 1 essentially. So capital 32 units. So labor is worth 32 units of capital in this case. So labor is very valuable in this production process because there aren't many laborers being used. And that means that the people that are being used are going to be very proficient in the production that they're doing, and therefore they're going to be very valuable in terms of like their expertise, their human capital, the amount of value they're adding to the production process. So this is one relationship. The other one is our production function at a level of 1,000. So now we've got, and then I plugged in here K equals 32.16 L for K, and then that got me to this line here. So I plugged in this expression there to get this into an expression of just L. And by doing that, I am incorporating into my selection of labor in the long run the condition that the marginal rate of technical substitution should be equal to the ratio of the market prices in order to make sure that the amount of labor I'm choosing is the amount that's going to minimize my cost in the long run. So here, divide both sides by 2573, raise both sides, so 1 over the power of 1 over 1.9 gets me to the optimal amount of labor to be 6.08. So the numbers aren't changing much here as far as like the example goes, but then as far as what they reflect, they're reflecting the right information. So basically, before the amount of labor was not the cost minimizing amount of labor, and now it is. The short run was limited by the fact that 20 units of capital were fixed and the firm couldn't minimize their cost of producing 1,000 units of output. So L equals 0.608. What is the long run cost of producing 1,000 cars? In the long run, everything is variable. So we need to figure out the exact amount of capital that's being employed. There are no fixed costs in the long run, so we need to figure out what is the variable amount of capital necessary to minimize the cost by basically just taking the amount we solve for here and then plugging that into either of our two expressions relating capital to labor, either the production function or the relationship between capital and labor that we got from that optimality condition that minimized the cost of producing 1,000 units. So now plugging that in, L.608, into that ratio of capital and labor gets me to the optimal amount of capital to be 19.56 units. So 19.56 units will minimize the cost of producing 1,000 cars. It's less than the 20 units that were being used. It doesn't seem like a lot, but it does wind up having a big impact on overall cost of production. So total cost in the long run is equal to, again, the value of all capital employed and the value of all labor, the value of all of the labor employed. Both of them are variable. You don't need to do the total cost as a function of quantity thing here because I'm not looking for an expression. I'm just looking for a number. So just multiplying the amount of capital times its price and then multiplying the amount of labor times its price will get us the total cost in the long run to be $70,606. So that's the long run total cost of producing 1,000 cars, which is the minimum amount the firm will need to spend on producing 1,000 cars. That's the best they can do given the fact that there are prices for capital and labor being set in markets that are beyond their control and the nature of their production process embodied by their production function. Yes?
So if the function tells them to lower the capital to a unit that's not a whole number.
Don't worry about that. Don't worry about like the practical implications of this particular problem because obviously it's not reality. So
But
in reality, they'd have to obviously they'd have to round up or down, right? So they'd have to do their best, right? But it would be a lot more realistic in terms of like the numbers, like it wouldn't be that absurd, like where you're only using 0.59 units of people to produce, right? It just doesn't make any sense. So don't worry about that. Just worry about the numbers and what they mean and why they mean something different than others and how you get to them and why you get to them in the way they do and how that reflects the models that we have that are very powerful, that explain a lot of things that ultimately in practice do wind up helping firms to minimize their costs, maximize their profits, lower prices in markets, increase efficiency for consumers. What is the short run cost of producing 1,000 cars with K fixed at 20? Well, we need to plug in Q equals 1,000 into our short run total cost function, which is 7626. So actually it didn't make a huge impact on the total cost. It reduced total cost by $20 in the long run, but nonetheless, hey, $20 is $20 in 1906, in which $20 will take you a long way. Maybe around the world even, who knows. Anyway, so you can see that by them being able to choose capital and labor in the optimal way by setting their marginal rate of technical substitution equal to the market rate of substitution, that they are able to minimize the cost of producing the output they're looking to target in the long run, and that's a good thing for firms. And you should be able to figure out how to do these things with these problems, which solidifies the logic and ideally your understanding of the models. Is the firm experiencing increasing, constant, or decreasing returns to scale? Increasing. Why? Right. And how come you can do that? Yes, we have a Cobb-Douglas production function, and therefore if you add the exponents, and in this case, if they're equal to greater than 1, then that tells you that doubling both inputs will more than double output. There are increasing returns to scale. That means there are decreasing average total cost in the long run. That means that in this industry, there's a very big cost advantage for firms to get bigger, because the bigger they get, the lower their average cost of producing, which then creates a barrier to entry to other firms, which then makes those kind of markets be a lot less competitive. All right, so yeah, so we add, so that's the easy way to do it. The more complicated way is to multiply each of our inputs by some factor a, and that means we have a times a raised to the power of 1.9, which is to the power of 0.9, which is equal to a raised to the power of 1.9. That means that if you increase k and l by some factor a, that output is going to be increased by some factor a to the power of 1.9, which is greater than a, which means there's increasing returns to scale, which is how you would solve for the returns to scale if the production function was not a Cobb-Douglas. All right, let's do one more of these. Bakery production in the short run and the long run. Doug wants to go into the donut business. For $500 a month, he can rent a bakery, K equals 1, complete with all the equipment he needs to make different kinds of donuts. He must pay donut bakers a monthly salary of $400 each. He projects his production function to be this Cobb-Douglas production function, where Q is tons of donuts per month. How many bakers will Doug hire to make 10 tons of donuts in the short run? How can we get that? Right, so first we have to plug in our K equals 1, right, to get into the short run, and then set that equal to 10 to solve for our labor. Divide both sides by 2, raise both sides, square both sides, and that gets you to 25 laborers. That's how many Doug will need to hire to create 10 tons of donuts in the short run. What is Doug's monthly short run total cost function and marginal cost function? So again, we need the fixed cost, we need the variable cost expression, so we're going to do all of that to get to our total cost function, and then we need to take the derivative to get the marginal cost function. So here, our fixed cost equals capital times labor, right? So we've got capital 1 unit, capital times the rental rate, which is $500 a month. So you've got 500 there. And then we need our variable costs, our wage times our labor in terms of quantity. So wages are 400. So we need L in terms of Q. We get that from the production function. So plugging in K equals 1, and then solving for L gets us to L equals Q over 2 squared. Sorry, this should be inside the parentheses. That the square should be outside. I apologize for that. Anyway, so here's our total cost expression. And the 2 squared is 4, and then I divide 400 by 4, so that's going to equal 100. So then I've got 500 plus 100 Q squared there. So that's my total cost. Now I'm going to take the derivative to get the marginal cost, right? So very simple, 200 Q is my marginal cost. What is the short run marginal product of labor when producing 10 tons? So again, you're being asked, what's the marginal product of labor when producing a certain amount? So you need to figure out how many laborers it takes to produce that certain amount, which we did, which is 25. And so now we take the derivative of the production function with respect to labor and then plug in our 25 to figure out how much extra output you can gain by employing that 26th laborer. So again, plugging in K equals 1 gets us into the short run. And then taking the derivative, multiply the whole thing by 1/2, subtract 1 from the exponent, gets you to L raised to the power of negative 1/2. So that's our marginal product of labor expression. Plugging in L equals 25 now gets me to, in this case, 0.2. So hiring an additional person, the 26th person, will result in additional 0.2 units of donuts. What is the return to scale? Increasing returns to scale, right? Cobb-Douglas production function. Add the exponents. They're greater than 1. So 1 plus 1.5 equals 1.5, which is greater than 1. So there are increasing returns to scale there. If Doug can modify the bakery in the long run, how many workers should he use to produce 10 tons of donuts? So now, again, we're looking for that long run amount of labor. That means that everything's variable. That means, once again, you need to do what we did earlier. You need to solve for the market rate, the market rate of substitution equal to the marginal rate of technical substitution. And then use that and the production function to get you to that optimal level of labor and capital that's going to solve for the minimum cost of producing 10 tons of donuts. So marginal rate of technical substitution, ratio of the marginal product of labor to the marginal product of capital. We set that equal to the slope of the isoquant, the wage over the rental rate. Marginal product of labor is equal to, take the derivative of this with respect to labor, So again, 1/2, that drops out. You're left with negative 1/2 there. So K times L raised to the negative 1/2. Take the derivative of this with respect to capital to get the marginal product of capital. So again, that's going to basically drop out the K, and you're left with 2L raised to the power of 1/2 equals the ratio of the wage, which is 400, to the rental rate, which is 500. And now just simplifying this will get us to the optimal ratio of capital to labor. So 1 unit of capital to 8/5 unit of labor is the amount that the two should be switched out for in order for us to get the least cost to produce 10 tons of donuts. We've got our production function, set that equal to 10 to get that second expression that we need relating capital and labor. Plugging in K equals, in this case, 1.6L. I just got the decimal version of 8/5 there. Plugging that into K there. Getting those together, you got L raised to the power of 3/2, and then 1.6 times 2 is 3.2. And then dividing 10 by 3.2 gets me to 3.125 on the left. And then raising both sides to L raised to the power of 1 divided by 1.5 gets me to the optimal amount of labor in the long run to be 2.14 units. So quite a bit less labor. Obviously, to minimize the cost of producing these donuts, it makes sense for this firm to utilize a lot more capital, a lot less labor in the long run to produce 10 tons of donuts. What is the total long run cost of producing 10 tons of donuts? Again, we're going to need the total amount of capital times the rental rate plus the total amount of labor times the wage rate. We have our total amount of labor, multiply that by the wage rate, and now we need to solve for the amount of capital by going back to that last problem, plugging in labor into one of our two expressions to get that amount of capital. So K equals 8/5 L, plug in L equals 2.14. So K equals 3.42 there, times 500, plus 400 times 2.14 gets me my long run cost of producing those 10 donuts to be $2,566. All right, so there you go. There's a lot of practice for you. It's not as difficult as it seems, but again, like we've been building up your intuition and knowledge of how all of this is related via, the introduction of the concepts of production, how they relate to costs, how all of that is related in the short run and the long run. And then we jumped into these problems in which you're expected to carry that understanding and merge it with your understanding of mathematics in order to be able to solve for this stuff and then be able to understand what kind of economic meaning the results have. So that's what you're expected to be able to do. I hope you can do it by the time the exam comes around. I hope that will happen. So make sure that does happen. I want things to work out well for those of you that are at least putting in some effort into this course. All right, now let us start with our first setting that we're going to consider for using the cost framework to compare it against the benefits of producing in these various contexts in order to identify how prices are being set in these markets and how those prices are being affected by the differing market conditions that, again, have everything to do with how competitive the markets are. The first market setting that we'll consider, again, is the most competitive setting, the perfect competition setting. So we'll first talk about the goal of profit maximization, because that's ultimately what we're talking about here. Like, firms are considered to be maximizing their profits. Subject to budget constraints, they are minimizing their costs. And so then if they're minimizing their costs, and which we assume that they are always doing, then the next thing they need to do is to maximize their revenues, and that will maximize their profits. So why do we consider the goal of profit maximization important? That's the first. So there's two issues that have to be clarified with respect to profit maximization. One is we have to understand why it makes sense to assume that firms try to maximize profits, and then we have to be clear about what profits are. What are we talking about? So we'll consider the second one first. Profits is equal to revenue, price times quantity, minus cost. But then the question is, what are we talking about when we're talking about costs? Well, we're talking about opportunity costs in economics. And so that is the kind of cost we're always considering. And so when we're talking about profits, we're talking about economic profits. So economic profits equal revenue minus opportunity costs. Again, the costs are opportunity costs, which include both explicit and the implicit costs, both what it actually costs to produce plus what you're passing up by producing. If you're investing a whole bunch of money into a production process, that money is not being invested in markets and getting some basic return. There is an implicit cost to producing, and that is taken into consideration as well. So profit is equal to revenue, price times quantity, minus the opportunity cost. And this is distinguished, this specification distinguishes these profits as economic profits from accounting profits, which are just revenue minus explicit costs. So these are things we talked about in chapter 1, but we'll quickly review it here just to kind of jog your memory and help you to understand exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about maximizing profits for these firms. So let's do a quick practice problem to just highlight the nature of economic profits. So Cullen Gates runs a miniature golf course in Valdosta, Georgia. He rents the course and equipment from a large recreational supply company and supplies his own labor. His monthly earnings, net of the rental payments, are $800. So that's his revenues. And he considers working at the golf course just as attractive as his only other alternative, working as a grocery clerk for $800 a month. So that's his opportunity cost to running his golf course, is the wages he could be earning if he was not running his golf course and working as a grocery clerk. So revenue from the golf course is $800 a month. The implicit cost of running the golf course is also $800 a month. Now Cullen learns that his Uncle Bill has given him some land in New York City, some like really prime land right in the middle of Manhattan. The land has been cleared, and Cullen discovers that a construction company is willing to install and maintain a miniature golf course on it for a payment of $4,000 a month. So again, we've got the revenue from the golf course, $800, the implicit cost of running the golf course, which is $800, and then he's got the explicit cost of installing the new golf course to be $400 a month. Cullen also commissions a market survey which reveals that he would collect $16,000 a month in revenue by operating a miniature golf course there. So the revenue from the new golf course would be $16,000 a month. After deducting that $400 a month payment to the construction company, this would leave him with $12,000 a month free and clear. Given these figures and assuming that the cost of living is the same in New York as in Valdosta, which is ridiculous, but whatever, should Cullen, a profit maximizer, switch his operation to Manhattan is the question. Well, seemingly it appears so, because he's going to be making some accounting profit. He's just taking into account his revenues minus his explicit costs. But he's not taking into account his opportunity costs of running the golf course completely. So if he stays in Valdosta, he's going to make $800 in revenue. Explicit cost is $0. Implicit cost is $800. So his economic profit is the difference between his revenue and his opportunity cost, which is the sum of these two, which is equal to $0. Open a golf course in Manhattan, $16,000 in revenue plus $4,000 in explicit cost. And implicit cost is going to be, of course, the $800 that he could be earning in Valdosta, either by running a golf course there or by working as a grocery store clerk. But we are not taking everything into consideration. So to calculate what his economic profits would be in New York, we must deduct from his $12,000 a month accounting profits not only the $800 a month opportunity cost of his labor, but also the opportunity cost of his land. We have to take into consideration all opportunity costs of all resources to produce. In this case, the land is one of those inputs that he is using to produce. Suppose we conservatively estimate that Cullen's land would sell for, let's say, $100 million in today's real estate market, and suppose that the interest rate is 1% a month. The opportunity cost of devoting the land to a miniature golf course will then be 1% of $100 million, which is equal to $1 million a month. And therefore, That is also an implicit cost for him opening up this golf course in Manhattan. So therefore, his total implicit cost to running the golf course in Manhattan is equal to $1,800,000. And therefore, his economic profit is negative $988,800. Therefore, not making it worth his while to open up a golf course in Manhattan. The point of the problem is to highlight the fact that whenever we're talking about economic profit, we are always taking into consideration the fact that the next best alternative use to all resources being used in production have to be taken into consideration as an implicit cost, part of the opportunity cost of producing. So it will thus be better for Cullen to sell or rent the land to someone else and remain in Valdosta. All right, now we will jump into the specifics of what it means to be operating in a perfectly competitive market. What are the conditions for a perfectly competitive market? So the first condition is that the firms sell a standardized product. Everybody sells the same thing. It's called a commodity generally. Commodities are very generic goods. Usually they're like the big inputs into like production, like oil, like very generic oil, not very raw oil, not produced, not oil that's ultimately used for cars, etc. Iron ore, even just like very general agricultural goods, oranges, wheat, things that you can't really do anything special with. You can't really create your own special version of wheat that's going to differentiate you from all your other competitors. Everybody has access to the production means of creating wheat. So anybody that wants to create a good in a perfectly competitive market can, because it's really easy to produce these things. So the product sold by one firm is assumed to be a perfect substitute for the product sold by any other. Consumers view the products as being exactly the same thing. So nobody can try to change prices. Everybody just has to sell the same thing at the same price, or else they won't be able to sell anything if anybody tries to raise the price, because everybody that is willing to buy has an infinite amount of options available to substitute away from, the high price seller. So therefore, firms are price takers in these markets. Firms accept the price that's being set in these markets. They cannot affect the price regardless of how much they're willing to supply in the market. Because again, there's so many participants in the market that the demand and supply forces aren't affected by the decisions of an individual firm in these markets. There is free entry and exit with perfectly mobile factors of production in the long run. So again, in the long run, when all inputs into production are variable, firms can easily enter and exit the industry. There are no barriers to entry, which is what limits competition in any market. So for a monopoly, you might have like a patent on a specific good that allows a firm to be the only seller of that good. That is known as a barrier to entry. As a result of that, in the long run, there is no free entry and exit in a monopoly setting. But in perfect competition, the things that people need to produce are available to them. So in the long run, everyone will be able to get what they need to produce. And if the firms aren't making any economic profit, in the long run, once they're able to get out of their contracts for maybe like their factory or their machinery, whatever it is that's keeping them in a limited capital short run situation, that will eventually go away in the long run, and people in these firms can exit at their own free will if they choose to. And firms and consumers have perfect information. Everybody knows exactly what the conditions are in the market. Everybody knows that there's an infinite amount of sellers selling the exact same thing at the exact same price. All the firms know that they have a bunch of competitors and that they're all selling at the same price, and therefore they can't change their price. Consumers know the quality of what is being sold. It's very clear that there's a standard quality for this very generic good, and if anybody tries to sell a lower quality, nobody's going to buy from them because everybody knows where to get alternatives. So it's as transparent as possible for a market, and therefore, again, that leads to the most competitive outcome possible. There's as much competition in these markets as there could possibly be in a market. A firm has no reason to leave its current industry if it has no way of knowing about the existence of more profitable opportunities elsewhere. So all firms are aware of all possible profit opportunities. If there are profits being made in this industry, in a perfectly competitive industry, everybody knows about it. So in the long run, because there are no barriers to entry, because there's free entry and exit, firms will enter into markets where there are economic profits being made, and they will erode those profits. If there are losses being made in these markets, then in the long run, firms will exit those markets, and eventually that will raise the price and cause the existing firms that remain to not be incurring economic losses, but making zero economic profit. So what this means is that in the long run, there is zero economic profit to be made in perfectly competitive industries. Now, when we're talking about economic profit, we're talking about the opportunity cost at least being covered. So when we're saying that firms make zero economic profit in perfectly competitive industries in the long run, we're saying that at least their opportunity cost is being covered. A consumer has no motive to switch from a high-priced product to a low-priced product of identical quality unless she knows about the existence of the latter. Again, consumers have all the information they need to make the right decisions about what they're buying. So we don't have to take into consideration like expected utilities based on them taking risks about purchasing one thing versus another. The quality is clear, so everything is very clear, so they know the kind of utility they're going to get from the things that they're going to buy. All right, let's talk about the short run condition for maximizing profits for these firms. So the first question to answer is, how does a firm choose its output level in the short run? So how do firms choose how much to supply in these markets? Again, they cannot affect the price of the market, so they can sell as much as they want at the price in the market. They are price takers. And so the question is, how much should they sell? Well, how much decisions in economics are best approached via marginal analysis. They have to compare the marginal benefit to the marginal cost. The marginal benefit of selling is how much extra revenue they gain from selling additional units. The marginal cost, well, that comes from their cost function. So we're going to consider their marginal costs in comparison to the marginal benefits, which are known as the marginal revenues, and that will dictate the optimal amount they're going to sell in these markets. So here is the revenues that the firms can earn. The revenues are linear and constant in the perfectly competitive markets because price is something that the firms simply take as given. Price does not change. Whether they sell 1 unit or 1,000 units, price is the same. So each additional unit they sell, the additional revenue they gain from selling it is going to be the same. It's going to be the price of what they're selling. That is not changing. And so therefore the marginal revenue is going to be constant. Marginal revenue is the slope of the total revenue curve. And so whenever you have a curve that has a constant slope, you're going to get a line. So that's why we've got a total revenue curve with a constant slope. Here the slope is equal to 18, which means the price is equal to 18. They also, of course, consider their costs because they're looking to maximize their economic profit. So here is their total cost function. Again, shaped the way we would expect it to be shaped, given what we have assumed about the most general generic production process. Again, initially there are increasing returns to our labor input, and then there are decreasing returns because of the short run limitations. But initially they do experience increasing returns because of the benefits of specialization, dividing up tasks, division of labor. And so therefore, marginal cost initially is decreasing, which is why the total cost curve kind of flattens out. And then eventually, once we get to that decreasing returns to labor, short run wall, then that's going to start to increase the cost of producing each additional unit, which means marginal cost starts to increase, which means the slope of our total cost function starts to increase. Profit is the difference between total revenue and total cost. So we see here that over this range, total cost is above the total revenue, so therefore the firm is not making economic profits there. And that's what we're seeing down here. This is profit on the y-axis, and again, quantity of output on the x-axis. So we see up until 4.7 units, costs are above revenues, and therefore profits are negative. Beyond that, revenues are above costs, and therefore there are profits to be made there over this range. So the relevant range of output for this firm is between 4.7 and 8.7 units. Beyond that point, total cost exceeds total revenue, which means profits become negative. And so it's going to be at the point where the distance between these two is at their greatest that the firm is making the most amount of profit, where they are maximizing their profit. So the profit maximizing level of output, the output level that they're going to choose, is going to happen at the point where the distance between these two curves is at their furthest. In this case, it happens to be at 7.4 units, in which profits are at their maximum, $12.6 a week apparently. At that level, total revenues are at 133.2, total cost is 120.6, so profits are $12.6. So that's one way of identifying the optimal output for this firm in a perfectly competitive market. Again, what's telling us it's perfectly competitive is that the total revenue curve is a straight line. The price is constant, so marginal revenue is constant. Now, at that optimal point of output, where profits are at their maximum, where the distance between revenue and cost are at their maximum, at that point, the slope of our revenue curve and our cost curve happen to be the same. So that is the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So remember, cost, the derivative of it is marginal cost, the extra cost of producing additional units. So that's the slope of our total cost function. At that optimal point of production, marginal cost equals marginal revenue. The slopes are equal, and the slope of the revenue line is equal to price. Marginal revenue is equal to price for a perfectly competitive firm, and therefore marginal cost equals price is the point at which the firm optimally operates in a perfectly competitive market. Marginal revenue, again, the change in total revenue that occurs as a result of a 1 unit change in sales. All right, so to get even better insights into this, we take the perspective of the firm on the perfectly competitive market. The perfectly competitive market has a downward sloping demand curve and upward sloping supply curve. Essentially, the market that we've been studying since the start of the course. That was the model of perfect competition. We didn't talk about it in those terms, but now we can. And so in that market, the market forces establish an equilibrium price, which is the price that the individual firm takes, and therefore that is the price they can sell at, and therefore that is their demand function. It is a perfectly elastic horizontal demand curve at the price that is being set in the market. So from the firm's perspective, this is their demand curve in a perfectly competitive market. It's a perfectly elastic horizontal demand curve. So here in this market, the demand curve this firm faces is the price being set at $18 in the market. Over here, there's a demand and supply schedule. The equilibrium is at $18. So therefore, that is the demand curve the firm faces, which is also its marginal revenue curve, because marginal revenue equals price for the perfectly competitive firm. In this case, marginal revenue equals $18. We know that at the optimal point of production for the perfectly competitive firm, they set their marginal revenue equal to the marginal cost. Here is our marginal cost curve. Same as what we've been looking at in the prior chapters, decreasing because of increasing returns to labor initially. At the minimum of marginal cost, that's where the decreasing returns to labor begins to take into effect as a result of the short-run limitation, which starts to bring up marginal costs. And here's an average variable cost curve. Again, the minimum of it occurs where marginal cost crosses it. These are essentially the cost curves we were looking at in the previous chapters that we're going to keep looking at as we move forward. Anyway, so this firm compares the marginal revenue, the demand they face, which is constant, to their marginal cost curve, and they choose their level of output to maximize profits, the point at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue, over the range where marginal cost is increasing. Because here marginal cost equals marginal revenue, but because of increasing returns to scale, increasing returns to labor, the firm knows that producing more will lower marginal cost. But over the range where marginal cost is increasing, past the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, the additional units produced will cost more per unit than the benefit they gain from selling, which is the marginal revenue, and therefore it doesn't make sense to go beyond that point. But before that point, it makes sense to continue increasing the scale of operation because additional units will yield additional benefits. The marginal benefit, the marginal revenue, is going to be greater than the marginal cost. So marginal revenue equals marginal cost is the point at which the firm will stop and produce that will maximize their profits in perfectly competitive markets. In this case, it's 7.4 units. So the firm should produce a level of output for which marginal revenue equals $18, which is equal to marginal cost on the rising portion of the marginal cost curve. The shaded rectangle here represents the maximum profits of the firm. So here is again, the marginal revenue curve. They set the optimal level of output at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Here is their average total cost curve, U-shape. There's the bottom of the U where marginal cost crosses it. At the optimal level of output, the average cost of producing is this much. So the difference between the price being charged and the average cost of production is profit for that unit. Multiplying that times the amount sold gets us to profit. And that's what this rectangle represents. It represents the fact that there are profits being made in this particular perfectly competitive market by this firm. This is the firm's perspective on the market, with its costs being, again, compared against the benefits of selling, which is the marginal revenue. Profit, represented by pi in economics, is equal to revenue minus cost, as we know. The area of the shaded rectangle is given by the base, Q, times the height, which is the average total cost. And that's going to get us the profits there. Quick practice problem before I let you go. The cost function for a firm is given by 5 plus Q squared. What does the 5 here represent? Fixed cost. So what is Q squared? It's our variable cost. It's also our variable cost equation. If the firm sells output in a perfectly competitive market and other firms in the industry sell output at a price of $20, what price should the manager of this firm put on the product? $20, right? Because they are price takers. They have to sell at the same price as everyone else. So they will charge the same price as everyone else. What level of output should be produced to maximize profit? So what is the condition the firm needs to consider to set their optimal level of output? Not the cost, but marginal something equal to marginal something? Marginal revenue equal marginal cost. Marginal revenue for a perfectly competitive firm equals, it's constant, so it equals, the marginal revenue is constant for a perfectly competitive firm. It equals the extra revenue they gain from selling additional units equals the what? It's constant. No. Equals the price being set in the market. The market is setting a price. The firm is a price taker. So it sets its marginal cost equal to its marginal revenue, which is equal to price. So for a perfectly competitive firm, it sets marginal cost equal to price. Marginal cost, what is marginal cost here? It's 2Q, the derivative of our total cost function. Set that equal to price, which is 20. Divide both sides by 2. That's going to get us to the optimal quantity to be 10. And then to figure out profits, we just figure out price times quantity minus the cost of producing 10 units. Price times quantity, 10 times 20, minus 5 minus 10 squared equals, in this case, $95. All right, folks. Have a great break. Work really hard. Don't forget everything. Work really hard on learning this stuff so that you don't have a rough time doing well in the exam. You're going to have other exams. It's clear you don't have this stuff down yet. So work to get this stuff down so you get a big advantage in this course if you do well in this exam. Have a great spring break. I'll see you when you get back.